Oof. Hello, folks, and welcome to the 9 p.m. Live. As promised, today we're going to cover, as was requested last night, and therefore I promised to address it, we're going to do another recap of what QAnon is and why it matters. Because it's getting a lot of attention in the news these days. Just remember, you heard it here first. We've been talking about QAnon for a while now. We're also going to talk about third-party transfers. Why? I don't know whether you've heard it. We addressed it once on the live, but it's actually a tremendous issue in New York City as well as other municipalities. And it has to do with basically the theft of property by municipal governments to transfer to other entities which are allied with your sort of municipal leadership. And it's used for rapid gentrification and to really just rob, in particular, Black and brown communities of their wealth. So we're going to get into those two things and the politics of it. But first, I just want a quick recap. You've probably heard me talking about the state committee for the last couple of weeks. Well, the state committee met today for its second meeting this month. And this was to do a few things. The first thing we did was we chose the electors. So if you ever wondered how the people in the Electoral College get into the Electoral College, the political parties vote in their state committees for who those folks should be. And then when you vote at the ballot box for who you want the president to be, they get electors based on the results of the popular vote. And those electors then are affiliated with one of the two parties who are then meant to vote for their party's candidates. So we chose the electors for the Democratic Party in New York State today. Hey, Simon, how's it going? The other thing we did is pass several resolutions. And the one that I'd like to call out today is a resolution about the DNC. And we've spoken about this before as well. But basically, I had authored, with the input of folks on the Progressive Caucus, to a resolution which would require that the state party put out a report detailing the geographic and demographic composition of the National Committee delegation from New York, so members of the DNC, and that would also require them to report their voting and attendance records. Now, through compromise and what have you, some of these things were stripped out. For example, requirements to report on the occupation and income of the state of the National Committee members was removed, as was the requirement to report on attendance. However, we did get the more important piece, which was the voting records of the DNC members. So now whenever they take a roll call vote, many votes are taken by voice vote, and there's no individual attribution of voting to National Committee members. But now whenever the DNC members in New York or from New York take a vote on the National Committee, we'll be able to access them, which is honestly absolutely ridiculously important, because how are you supposed to make an informed decision about your representation if you don't know the decisions that they're making and how they're making their decisions? So, for example, there were a couple of roll call votes this year. For example, whether or not we should have a presidential primary debate about climate. There was a couple of other really controversial DNC votes, the elimination of debates. So I'm really, really happy to say that this rules change, which I authored, actually got passed. I had been tapped to author it by the Progressive Caucus, so I do want to say that a lot of people contributed to this, and it wouldn't have passed without their help and their willingness to work with Jay Jacobs, who's the chair, to get a compromise together that would pass the state committee. But I'm really happy to say that we got those votes, and we got the ethnic, demographic, and geographic composition reports of the DNC, because now we can actually start to make informed decisions as state committee members as to whether or not the National Committee delegation from New York actually represents the state. So that was big. All right, let's talk about QAnon. And just, ironically, Dorian, thank you, Simon. Thank you. Dorian, who asked this question last night, isn't even here to listen to the explanation. He was like, can you cover QAnon? And I was like, it's too big to cover in the middle of a show that has already started, but whatever, he's not here. I'm going to do it, and then he'll just have to watch it later. QAnon. QAnon is a conspiracy theory that started online, which has really taken on a tremendous life of its own and is dramatically impacting American politics. Whether you know it or not, QAnon is making inroads into mainstream politics. For example, 50 people associated with the QAnon movement, conspiracy theory, actually ran for office this year, okay? One of them is extremely likely to win their congressional race, and we have, again, 50 folks who are running. One of them is going to be the Republican candidate for a U.S. Senate seat. That person probably won't win, but one of the congressional candidates probably will. So what is QAnon about? QAnon is all about, and we've been over this a couple of times now, but QAnon is all about a conspiracy that there's an elite cabal of mainly Democrats, but the wealthy elite as well, including George Soros and all those sorts of typical liberal monsters, I guess you'd say. All those folks are involved in a cabal in which they kidnap, traffic, abuse, sexually molest, and kill children for a life-extending or psychedelic chemical known as adrenochrome. And it's unclear, depending on what you read, what exactly adrenochrome does. We've been over this again before, but what I will say is that adrenochrome does exist, but it's not derived from the blood of children who have been abused. But basically the idea is adrenochrome is related to adrenaline. It's produced in the not pituitary gland, in the, yes, I think the pituitary gland inside the brain, and that it's activated by the release of adrenaline that then gets processed and then creates adrenochrome. And that adrenochrome is, again, alternately a super psychedelic drug that the elite love, or a life-extending drug that makes you immortal, right? Either way, all of these elites are totally into it, and so they go around doing these terrible things to children. For example, the USS Comfort, which was sent to New York to help with the coronavirus cases, was supposedly there to actually traffic children for the elite so that they could move them into and out of New York City and extract, again, this adrenochrome chemical. Now, that's the general thesis of the QAnon folks. They derive this basically from a bunch of posts from a person or persons known as Q, who are anonymous, hence QAnon, which originated on the 4chan website, who claims to be a member of the military or intelligence community, one of those two, who is leaking breadcrumbs to average Americans to inform them about a war that's currently going on within the government. That is to say that the Hillary Clinton faction of the global elite tried to has been running the US government for some time now, and Hillary Clinton was meant to be the continuation of this cabal's power over the United States. The military, then, is an opposing faction, which is against the cabal, and the generals high up in the military handpicked Trump to insert him as president to combat the influence of these high-ranking elite. Therefore, or thereby, the defeat of Hillary Clinton was a huge step forward in the effort to end this giant conspiracy of child trafficking and abuse and murder. Now, you might remember that pretty much all of the high-ranking military officials have now come out against Donald Trump, but that doesn't weigh too heavily on the QAnon people. that's how QAnon got started. Now for the consequences of this. The QAnon folks tend to be militant. In fact, oftentimes violent. You might remember Pizzagate, in which somebody went to a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. with an assault rifle and tried shooting up the joint because of a pedophile sex ring in the basement. That was all about QAnon and the theory that the pedophile sex basement was linked to Hillary Clinton through John Podesta. And again, they were there to harass and molest those children. Right? In order to get the adrenochrome, you have to create a life-threatening situation. And in fact, like a lethal situation, which causes that release of adrenaline, blah, 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 so on and so forth. Apparently, it's best from children. Right? That's the life-extending power of youth, I suppose. Now, obviously, that was all bullshit. The pizza shop did not have a basement at all, in fact. But people take this QAnon nonsense quite seriously. And that, I think, will take us to the final segment of this, which is why the QAnon conspiracy theory is just so absolutely terrifying, and everybody should know about it and be vehemently opposed to it. Now, I will say that I have known Q conspiracy theorists in my day. They've sent me lots of information. A lot of my knowledge about this and why I was like way ahead of the mainstream media on this was because I knew Q people, and I read a extremely long Medium post. I believe it was a Medium post called "The Protocols of Light," that were all the steps that Donald Trump was taking to rein in this cabal, how the media was being played by the Trump administration, and how the media was trying to manipulate the public into being against Donald Trump, and how it was all a big masterfully orchestrated, multi-dimensional chess game in which Donald Trump would silence and destroy his critics, resulting in a basically peace on earth sort of deal. Anyway, there were some timelines put forth, and there have been a lot of predictions made by the QAnon folks about what exactly is going to happen over the course of this. Actually, before we get into why it's so frightening, perhaps I'll just lay out some of the sorts of predictions that they talk about. So, I'll talk a little bit about how the QAnon conspiracy theory actually works, what they predict, and then we'll get into why it's so terrifying. So, first, the QAnon conspiracy theory is really based off of all of these really, really loose threads that are just sort of bouncing about the internet. For example, they link Hillary Clinton to this cabal through John Podesta because, as you might recall, the DNC emails got hacked and the Hillary campaign's emails got hacked. And in an exchange between John Podesta and somebody else, they're talking about a dinner party. And John Podesta mentions how much he loves walnut sauce. Now, the pituitary gland happens to be shaped like a walnut, and the code lingo for adrenochrome is walnut sauce because it comes from this gland that is shaped like a walnut. Other pieces are now, this is going to sound maybe a bit odd, but like the whole Russiagate thing was proof to them that the deep state was trying to take down Donald Trump. Now, obviously, this is predicated on the idea that you believe rather that Donald Trump is completely innocent and never colluded with Russia, and so this was a takedown attempt. What the QAnon folks said was that all of the evidence that was being released and all the trickling of evidence that was being released about Donald Trump's associations with Russia and all of his compatriots was actually planned, and that Donald Trump was working with Mueller to string out this narrative of Russia so that at the last moment they would reverse it, revealing that it was all a ploy, and having overextended the media's narrative, the media would have no way to back out of it and would be shown to be dupes and liars and fools, which would completely destroy the credibility of the mainstream media by revealing them as false propagators of news, of like fake news, right? Obviously, that didn't happen, and Mueller could not have been clearer in his condemnation of Trump's behavior. I suppose he actually could have been clearer, because then maybe Donald Trump would have been impeached. But for Mueller, it was pretty clear. Certainly it wasn't a big switcheroo where he was in tandem with Trump, leaving little breadcrumbs to overextend the media's narrative and overextend the Democrats so he could reverse it on them and make them all look like fools, thereby setting up Donald Trump for a political coup. Speaking of coups, the ultimate end goal of QAnon is actually the release of sealed documents which indict all of Donald Trump's political opponents. Which indict all of the people who are in this elite cabal of sex trafficking of children to get the adrenochrome, all of whom happen to be Donald Trump's opponents. And this really takes us to the most important part of the QAnon conspiracy theory, not because, it's a crazy conspiracy theory, but because it advocates actively for Donald Trump, who is in a position of power right now, to unilaterally and extrajudicially arrest all of his political opponents and summarily execute them. So Donald Trump has a rabid base, which he has not disavowed, right? He's been asked about this. He's been told that what they believe is that his political opponents, Democrats and wealthy elites who support Democrats, not Republicans, obviously, are murderers and pedophiles and what have you. And his response is, if I can help fight bad things in the world, that's what I want to do, basically. So he has a rabid fan base who love him as basically a messiah or a savior from a very large, very complex conspiracy. And they would like to see him empowered to just kill anybody he believes is linked to it, which is exactly that is authoritarianism. That's witch hunts. That's whatever bad word you want to use. That's gulags. That's concentration camps. That's secret police. That's Stasi. Whatever word you want to use to describe a government that can finger anybody that opposes the government and kill them. That's what that is, right? So people running on that platform, people who believe in that, are extremely dangerous. And just so that you know, the narrative here is that, all of these things, I mentioned some things that were supposed to happen, the big switcheroo with Mueller, the big overextension of the media, the big overextension of the Democrats on the Russia narrative. The big culmination of this is something called the storm. And the storm is basically when Trump, when Trump reveals that there have been investigations against all of these people, and then arrests them, unseals all of the investigations, basically claiming that, look, I have all this evidence. All of these people are bad. I have all this evidence. There have been investigations forever. Basically, exactly what happened to him, except he wasn't around, with the wiretapping of Trump Tower and all of the investigations, the nefarious activities which he's conducted. Basically, he's just going to come out and be like, actually, I've been doing that to everybody else, and now I'm going to arrest them, and I'm going to kill a bunch of them. The pineal gland. Thank you, Chris O'Hara. The pineal gland. That's the walnut. That's the walnut in the center of the brain. All right. So that's QAnon. That's why it's scary as shit. And that's why we really cannot allow those folks to be elected, and really, really cannot have Donald Trump win for another term. I just want to be very clear about this. The QAnon folks are ready to be violent for Donald Trump. Their objective is to kill or at the very least arrest the people who they view as detractors of the Trump administration, because almost by default, those people are either in this conspiracy or are aiding and abetting these conspirators. And so if you don't come around to their point of view and accept that Donald Trump is fighting the evil of the world and that these people are the evil of the world and represent that evil, you belong in jail. Like, you're irredeemable. So that's the deal, folks. Okay, so let's take the questions on this, and then we're going to do third-party transfer because that's very, very important. Oh, check this out. According to Simon posted a big old thing, but basically RNC speaker pulled after tweet surfaced promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. By the way, in case you weren't aware, in case I wasn't clear about this, I guess I probably wasn't, the QAnon conspiracy theory is anti-Semitic. A lot of it has to do with Hollywood, the media, and George Soros. It's really centered on the Jews, as well as like these other elites, but included in those elites, it's very much implied that there's a lot of Jewish bankers in there. I'm not going to read all of this stuff that Simon posted. Interesting comment, but it's basically about it's an article. It's about somebody who's removed from the speaking lineup at the RNC for anti-Semitic comments on Twitter, which is interesting because I wasn't aware that the RNC cared anymore about anti-Semitism. I kind of think that like they literally don't care, and like they just assume they'll get away with anything at this point. But I will say that the extension of the QAnon problem can be seen in this abandonment of the Republican Party, of a Republican Party platform, right? They've simply given up on the idea that they're going to have any ideas for governing other than supporting Donald Trump, who is now literally dictator. Literally what he says is what the Republican Party believes, and what he wants is what they do. It's frightening. Michael Kaplan. Soros always seems to come up. Not a coincidence that he's Jewish. It's horrible when Jewish Americans get scapegoated as corrupt and disloyal, generally bad citizens to people, as explanations for why things aren't the way some want them to be. Isn't it horrible when Jewish Americans get scapegoated as corrupt and disloyal, generally bad citizens to people as explanations for why things aren't the way some want them to be in policy? Yes, of course, scapegoating is not good. Let's see. We need to go back to the pre-Trump days when we called conspiracy theorists idiots and then ignored them. Well, speaking of conspiracy theories, I would like to talk about third-party transfer because this has been spoken about and it sounds like a conspiracy theory, and a lot of people ignored it like it was a conspiracy theory, but in fact, it's real. It's nowhere near as wacky as the QAnon conspiracy theory, but it has to do with the fact that it's rooted in actual verifiable fact. The big thing about QAnon is it's just a bunch of tangent facts interrelated by a story. Third-party transfer started off as a bunch of stories of people saying that the city was taking their homes. But in fact, the city was taking their homes under something known as third-party transfer. And I bring this up tonight because there was an article in, I forget which publication it was, but basically there was an article about two legislators in Queens who are trying to pass a bill at the state level to prevent the de Blasio administration from giving to outsourcing the collection of tax liens, which has to do with the idea of third-party transfers. So what are third-party transfers, also known as TPT? Well, basically, most cities have on the books a law that if your property is delinquent on taxes to some degree, or is not being properly upkept, that the city can basically take control of it and give it to another owner. Now, in New York City, this was begun during the 1970s and 80s when people were simply abandoning their properties. Properties would become derelict. They would be way behind on their taxes. And so the city would simply claim the properties and then give them to another to rehabilitate. That might have been a bit necessary in the 70s. People were, of course, setting fire to their properties for the insurance money because it was more valuable than holding on to the land. But in the modern day, it's being used as a tool to dislocate Black and brown communities and gentrify neighborhoods. And you can tell because the properties which are being claimed are not derelict, and they're not necessarily that far behind on their taxes. So here's how it works. If your property is behind on its taxes up to at least 25% of its value, the city can come and take control of it if you refuse to enter into a payment plan. Alternatively, if your property is 15% behind, if your property is behind on taxes at least 15% of the value of the property, then the city can take control of it if it has one of varying features, which makes it, quote, derelict, which is to say that it has an average of 5 violations on it, or any number of other minutia, right? Now, this can really be used against folks who are behind on their taxes for any number of reasons, to find an excuse to simply take their property from them. Now, you're supposed to be able to fight this and regain control of your property by entering into a repayment plan. But as it turns out, the city hasn't been doing a great job notifying people. So what would happen is it would look for properties where there was a lien or an unpaid water bill, right? So it's like this owing the city money. So there's a lien for back taxes or an unpaid water bill, or and then they've got some violations on the property, and then they would enter into these third-party transfer proceedings. They would then fail to notify the owners, or they would trump up the charges against, they would trump up the violations. They'd send people there to go issue more violations, or they would send an assessor to reduce the estimated value of the house so that the relative cost of the house to the lien would go down, right? Because you need to hit 15%, right, to do the land grab, and then they would take the deed to that property and transfer it to a third party. Now, normally these third parties are nonprofits, right? It has to go to a nonprofit, but ultimately what happens is the nonprofit takes it into receivership and then is responsible for kind of rehabbing it and sending it off to somebody who's actually going to sell the property or rehabilitate it. And that becomes your developer. So this has been happening all over Brooklyn and Queens. And the bill that was in the news today was introduced by 2 legislators in Queens, Leroy Comrie and David Weprin. Let's not talk about them today. Let's just talk about the fact that what their bill would do is it would ban the city from outsourcing lien collection during the pandemic. So this is a related problem, but not exactly the same as third-party transfer. Again, third-party transfer was about hitting some threshold of the value of your property relative to the tax burden. So 25% of your property value you owe in taxes. City can take it. 15% of your property value owed in taxes, as long as you have one other thing like an unpaid water bill or 5 violations, the city can take it. What's happening right now is that the city finds properties that have liens against them and then sells those liens to debt collectors, just as a private company would sell debt in another situation. But the problem here, there's lots of problems with debt collection, but ultimately the problem here is that the debt collectors go out and the homeowners don't respond to the debt collectors or don't enter a payment plan with the debt collectors. Then the debt collectors have the opportunity to seize the property basically as collateral. So you can see here, or rather I should say that this debt is collateralized by the deed to that property. So it's not that they use it as collateral and hold it for the repayment. It's that if these people fail to pay, then these debt collectors, which have bought the liens, have the opportunity to seize the property. And again, we have a situation where the government is able to pick and choose whoever it wants, really, to sell these liens to, and it basically amounts to a subsidized transfer of property because the homeowners don't owe the full value of their property to the city. Debt is sold at pennies on the dollar. So you buy the debt for less than the value of the actual debt. And then these people go out to collect. And when people can't pay, they seize an entire property, which is worth much more than the debt. It gets a bit more complicated, though, or a bit more troublesome, however, because during a pandemic, there are lots of people who cannot pay their property tax, and lots of people who then can't even enter into a repayment plan because they've lost their jobs, they've lost their income. We're in the middle of a fucking economic crisis. So, this bill would prevent the city from selling off liens, which it is, and I can't just enough, currently doing. Now, the city was about to do a batch of these, but it put them off due to pressure, but it was only put off until September 6th. Now, if you're unaware, September 6th is only like 2 weeks away. So this is a bill that really needs to be passed, and we'll see what happens in the legislature. But as you might imagine, there are some powerful interests behind this, mainly debt collectors. They've got a huge stake, and real estate. So, you know, I don't know what's going to happen with this bill, but what I can absolutely say is that third-party transfer has been a huge problem for a long time, and it's been largely ignored by elected officials, even as people have begun to accept that it is actually happening, and it's not happening in a responsible way. The fact that a related problem would be exacerbated during the pandemic and the government would take no action to do anything about it, and that the pandemic amount not just to a huge transfer of government money to mega corporations through tax breaks at the federal level, but actually at our local city level, amount to whoever's buying up debt in a pandemic and an economic crisis is just absolutely egregious. Like, this administration, it's sickening the way this is going down. They should really suspend the program. Now, I'm not saying that programs like this shouldn't exist at all. The government does need to receive tax money to pay for things, and the real estate tax is on an insubstantial insubstantial component of our municipal revenue, and there need to be punishments for people who don't pay taxes because, well, actually, why? Well, because people have to pay taxes and, pay their fair share in society so we can have a working transportation system, working sanitation, and the way that it's being targeted towards Black and brown communities, which then enables wealthier. There really needs to be a full investigation on this, and the processes and procedures need to be updated to ensure that vulnerable people aren't being taken advantage of, and that wealth is not being sucked out of communities and handed to real estate developers and mega corporate landowners like Thor Equities and Vornado and what have you. So there's some comments here. So let us get to it. If something is rooted in fact, it's not a conspiracy theory, says Michael Kaplan. Yeah, well, it's really about what's like. That's true. It's true. But a lot of what makes something a conspiracy theory is whether or not people perceive it to be a conspiracy theory, right? So at first, the third-party transfer narrative that was being used as a tool by wealthy people and the government in cahoots to gentrify neighborhoods was viewed as a conspiracy theory because there's no facts to prove that. All you can proper city procedure. The answer is that you have to look at like the pattern of it was used before as an enforcement as to the rationale for it or the political motivation. That can be very difficult to prove. It all comes down to property tax being really bad form. It's been a huge issue for a while, and honestly, I only learned about it in 2019, which when people who were organizing asked me to come check out their organizing group. The more you learn about it, just the more disgusting it is. It's like if you found out that redlining still existed. Yeah, I understand that like redlining sort of like still exists as a cultural institution, but it's like it's legal, right? It would be like if you found out the redlining maps that the government produced and worked with banks to enforce still existed. It's just like that crazy. One of the Queens reps is from my district. I didn't vote for him. I'm going to say that Comrie and Weprin are not my favorite legislators, but this is an important issue. They're on the right side of this. David Asher Koropkin, if people that it will be coming for their property, and that it has to afford people the opportunity to enter a repayment plan. But what I can also say is that, and now here's where it starts to get really messed up, and it starts to get a bit conspiratorial. What I will say is that in the group and it starts to get a bit conspiratorial. What I will say is that in the group that I visit, anecdotally, and I don't have, court documents to show this, but what I heard anecdotally from multiple people was that when they would go to challenge these attempts to seize their properties, they would end up in court, and the judge would dismiss their cases. The judges would not hear what they had to say and decide in favor of the city. Basically, that the judicial process wasn't working for them. And the only reason I believe that is because I know and have been involved in how judges are selected. And in Brooklyn, it's very bad. They're very much aligned with the political power brokers who give them their positions, which makes them aligned with the interests of the city administration. But it goes quite deep in manipulation of the system to avoid notice requirements, to avoid responsibility and accountability in court, and to do things surreptitiously. For example, it was also brought up that council members are supposed to review all of these third-party transfers in their district, that they have the capacity to be notified about them, and that they simply don't look at them. And this has been going on for a long time, but it's not necessarily the fault of the council members because they have no idea what these documents are. They're just presented with these things, and it's like, okay, somebody's behind on their taxes. So all of this is really, there's a lot of obfuscation going on. Simon Sachs. Ben, my understanding is that there's a moratorium on utilities to collect during the pandemic. Therefore, uncollected debt can't be sold to a third party. We'll need to research it. Yes, I think that's true. Utilities, yes, but this is for tax collection on entities which had liens against them, I believe, before the pandemic, which are still fair game. 4-7080, which I suppose is, oh, here we go. Here we go. Shit, that's long. Oh, wow. What is it generally? Disconnections of households. Yeah, this is about utilities not being able to disconnect or collect on money owed during the pandemic. So if you want to stop paying your electricity, go ahead. But ultimately, it's doing right now is proceeding with the collection of taxes owed, which had led to the generation of liens against property, I believe, before the pandemic. So the pandemic hit, or had failed to pay rent before the pandemic, those folks can still be evicted from their homes. They're not protected by the eviction moratorium, at least not anymore. The courts have lifted that. So, there's a bunch of things which are machinations of the back are starting to get back underway, even though there's been no relief for the economic crisis the pandemic has caused. So all of the things that would have been bad before now are exponentially worse for the people facing them, because it's not like they can easily find new jobs to make up for the fact that they are being evicted from properties in which they couldn't afford the rent to begin with. It's a dark situation. It's dark days. Our government's doesn't seem to be doing much. It really is quite bothersome. Now, I'm sympathetic to the fact that the city government, even though it does have its limitations, I'm also sympathetic to the fact that the city government, even though it does have its limitations, and is experiencing a shortfall. And I'm also sympathetic to the fact that the state government cannot take on debt. Right? It must balance its budget. Ultimately, this really falls at the feet of the federal government. And the more chaos that the cities are in between now and the election, the better off I think Trump views his potentials, because he's ultimately invested in the idea that democratically controlled cities and urban areas are crime-ridden infestations of immigrants and what have you. And so, he wants it all to fall apart before he's elected so that he can save everybody and be the law and order candidate. David Korobkin, sorry, what I'm trying to ask, if there are legal protections attached to property tax debt and the debt is sold to third parties, why would the third-party purchasers have to follow those same notice requirements, etc.? I don't know the answer to that. My suspicion, or what I would think, is that the transfer to the third-party debt collector is only done after those notifications have been sent out. Now, in this particular case, what I'll say is I don't know how those notices are sent, or whether those notices are really being done properly. Because I know that there was funny business before, but a lot of people aren't in the city to receive their mail because of the pandemic. And a lot of folks are incapable either way of entering into payment plans because they've lost their jobs or are under other financial duress, again, due to this economic crisis we're in. So I suppose the answer to your question is I don't know the answer to that. They may have notice requirements of their own, or they may come into the process after the notice requirements have been met. So there you have it. In any event, that covers everything that I wanted to touch on tonight. If there's no more comments or questions, there, in fact, is another one. Michael Kaplan, city is allowed to have an operational deficit, just not capital program borrowing. The city is allowed to have an operational deficit, and it can borrow for capital programs. It can take out bonds, and it can run a deficit. But we try not to, because that's how New York City, actually New York itself, has some limitations on this that date back to the 70s when the city went bankrupt. We actually moved some of them. It's so funny. We removed some of them recently in our last charter revision, actually to do with a rainy day fund, because we were like, oh, New York's in such rude health. It's time to start behaving like a city that wasn't once in bankruptcy, and then boom, pandemic. But the city is allowed to run a deficit, and it can borrow for capital projects. So yes. But the city is also facing a huge shortfall of revenue because taxes are down, and it's facing increased expenditures as well at the same time. So, it's not a good situation all around. What it gains, though, from selling off these liens is I don't really know. Short-term cash, but less than it would receive from the property owners directly. Perhaps it saves on the money it would spend to enforce the debt collection, but it's just going to have a bigger problem when all these folks lose their homes and the homeless population goes up. Yeah, super interesting. In any event, with that, I want to thank everybody who tuned in today, and I'll see you tomorrow, which is what? Wednesday already? No, really? Is today Tuesday? Is tomorrow Tuesday? I'm really curious. What is today? Somebody help me. All right, whatever. I'll see you tomorrow. It's not the weekend. I'll see you tomorrow at 9. Michael Kaplan with the last word. In New Jersey, planned deficits aren't allowed for municipalities. I don't know if we can have a planned deficit. I'm not really sure about that. We just end up with deficits. And with that, I'll see you tomorrow at 9. I'll have an answer to your question on that for tomorrow, Mike. Later.